Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and welcome to our webinar for this afternoon on the subject of ESG and energy. We'll get to our very distinguished panel in just a moment. First, I would like to call all of your attention to the possibility of submitting questions for the last part of the hour. We will take questions from the audience, and in the dashboard you have on the right side of your screen, there's a questions tab. If you just type in your questions as we go along, we'll get to as many as we possibly can from you at the second part of the hour. The other piece I would like to encourage everyone to check out is part of the Our Energy Policy program called Our Energy Library. It's within our website and has a huge number of resources for all of you working on energy issues, and particularly with respect to today's topic of ESG. We have numerous papers, reports, studies, articles on this topic, and we encourage you to go and have a look at that. Finally, I would like to thank my co-host Broadscale for co-hosting this event today, and also all of our partners, API, Bracewell, Citi, the Clean Fight New York, Con Edison, the J.M. Kaplan Fund, Shepard Mullen, the Grace Richardson Fund, U.S. Grid, Schiff Harden, EPSA, National Grid, and Eastern Generation, and our series underwriter BP for all of their support for everything we've been able to do with this webinar series. So I'm going to turn it over now to Maribel Ayers, our moderator. Maribel has decades as a leader in the energy and environmental field, the founder of the Lighthouse Consulting Group. She was the head of political strategy for the Climate Action Partnership during the Obama years. I could go on, but she has an incredibly distinguished record, including tremendous expertise on this subject of ESG. I'm now going to turn it over to Maribel to introduce our panel and get the conversation started. Thanks, Maribel.
Thank you, Bill. It's a privilege to be here. Our mission today is to explore the evolving scope of ESG, the acronym of environmental, social, and governance factors, and their distinct values in the energy sector. We're fortunate that our three speakers bring a range of perspectives, including environmental justice, the investor community, state government, and the electric power sector. While the concept of sustainability reporting has been evolving over the past 25 plus years, beginning initially with an E focus, it has expanded to include a larger swath of S and G, as in social and governance components, aimed at serving the investor community and civil society at large. Indeed, our expectations of ESG and corporate citizenship have become both more expansive and more granular. And all would agree that the past 15 months of the COVID pandemic has served to increase the pressure on transparent reporting of non-financial disclosures and ESG performance criteria. In setting the stage, I offer three reference points. First, the political landscape. Early in the new year, President Biden demonstrated a commitment to tackling the climate crisis, a word which shows up 146 times in his 58-page budget plan and requires every agency to make environmental justice a part of its mission. This additional commitment is a cornerstone of his presidency, and in fact, he's proposed a near $1 billion to launch an accelerating environmental and economic justice initiative at EPA, and we'll hear more about this from our panelist, Jackie Patterson. Second are the issues of transparency, reporting, and measurement, crucial to the investor community and the many ESG sustainability funds. To my knowledge, we do not yet have a standardized format, either nationally or internationally, for ESG criteria. There are, however, diverse approaches among individual industries, the rating agencies, and standard-setting organizations. It's worth noting that the World Economic Forum and its International Business Council, which is chaired by an American CEO, Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan, is working to achieve globally accepted ESG standards based on the 4 pillars, and these pillars are critical to our discussion today: planet, people, prosperity, and principles of governance. My third point of reference for our discussion is ESG leadership in the corporate sector, or what I like to call tone at the top. There are an abundant examples, and we will soon hear from Sandy about one of them. But I would first like to highlight BP's sustainability report and its opening letter from CEO Bernard Looney, in which he states, and I quote, "Profits or purpose need not be a choice, and instead can work together in service of all stakeholders." He lists 20 focus areas divided into 3 categories: getting to net zero, improving people's lives, and caring for our planet. Now, to introduce our all-star panel: Sandy Nessing, Jackie Patterson, and Adam Zarofsky. First, Sandy. With 25 years in the utility industry, she has responsibility for managing sustainability strategy, stakeholder engagement, and ESG performance reporting for American Electric Power. She chairs the company's Sustainability Council and ESG team. She serves on the Edison Electric Institute's ESG Sustainability Steering Community, and she leads the company's participation in the Electric Power Research Institute's sustainability programs. Next, Jackie Patterson. Jackie is director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. She has worked as a researcher, program manager, advocate, and activist on women's rights, violence against women, HIV and AIDS, racial justice, economic justice, and environment and climate justice. She serves on the board of several nonprofit organizations, including the International Committee of the U.S. Social Forum and the U.S. Climate Action Network. And then Adam Zarofsky. Adam brings both an investor and state government expertise to our panel. He is executive director of Rewiring America, a new enterprise he founded which promotes electrification through data. He was previously director of state policy and agency management for the state of New York. Adam also served as deputy secretary for energy and finance for the state of New York. A graduate of Harvard Law School, he practiced law for many years and was a senior advisor to Standard & Poor's, the world's largest credit rating agency. He currently teaches climate policy at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Now, let's dive right in and begin by asking each of our panelists to define the E, the S, and the G from their individual perspectives. Could we begin with you, Sandy?
Of course, and thanks, Maribel, and thanks for the opportunity today. When I think about ESG and how it impacts American Electric Power, climate is certainly front and center for my company from the E side. But what we've seen in the past year is that the S, the social issues, have kind of gone from the back seat to the front seat, sitting right next to climate, coming at us all at the same time. And from the S perspective, it really is diversity, equity, and inclusion, human capital management, and supply chain resiliency. Those are some of the top issues for us. And from a governance perspective, which oversees all of that, it really is about board engagement and oversight, but also their proficiency on these issues. And so, you know, that's the ESG universe from AEP's perspective.
Great, thank you, Sandy. Jackie.
Thank you. Yeah, so I would say in terms of environmental issues, I would say that commitment to perfect environment is something else for our existence, including to ambition and strong greenhouse gas emissions, as well as a commitment to that harm our environment, and really practices ultimately with being in harmony with Earth systems as opposed to disrupting Earth systems. Second, in all Secondly, in terms of social, sorry, there's a bit of echo. Is everyone else hearing that echo?
I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Yeah, there's also a bit of an echo. Go on mute when we're not talking. But also in terms of social, it would be everything, making sure that at the very least, relates to the,
Apologies for jumping in. This is Kevin with Our Energy Policy. Maribel, if we could have you turn down your speakers just a little bit, I'm fairly certain that's where the feedback is coming from. Okay, thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay, thank you for doing so. So secondly, in terms of, it is really thinking intentionally, no harm as it relates to social issues, whether we're talking about the ways that we act intentionally and how we structure our business models and so forth that actually seek to redress some of the inequities in society, the wealth differentials, the job differential, and so forth. These are the types of what we would put under the category of social. And then as it relates to governance, also thinking about who is making decisions, whether it's the board or whether it is senior executives within the organization, really thinking broadly about decision-making structures within an organization, but also thinking about as we work, all of the work that we do as companies or otherwise is in some type of, there's a community that surrounds the work. So making sure that communities, and this really ties also with the social aspects, that communities have a role in decision making about what actually happens that impacts their communities, what's happening in their community. So when I think of governance, I think of it broadly in that sense. And then I would also say, as it relates to governance, is how we play a role in our broader governance and democracy, making sure we're being intentional about not having an outsized influence through lobbying and so forth on what's actually happening as it relates to the governance of our nation and world. So those were the definitions I was looking for ESG. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Would I be correct in when you talked about governance, another aspect of this is stakeholder engagement. So when you're talking about the community, very often in the business world, we use that phrase, the stakeholder engagement. And of course, the secret sauce is really how you map your stakeholders and understand them. Adam.
Thanks, Maribel, and thanks obviously to everybody at OEP for having me back. It's always fun to be part of these, and Sandy and Jackie, nice to join you as well. So as I think you mentioned in introducing Maribel, I kind of come at this from a couple different perspectives. I tend to joke that I'm one of the few environmentalists who actually came to ESG from the G side as a corporate lawyer representing boards for many years. So, perhaps the least, not the typical route, but because of that, I think of ESG both on two axes. The first being what it means for, say, a company or a player in industry or the market, and thinking about risks and opportunities that are presented by what is clearly a movement that keeps gaining steam around ESG. But then I also think, in with my hat as policymaker and regulator, I think about what is ESG, what do we at a societal level want to see, or what can happen as a result of this. So I think when you think about the both of those trends happening and how they meet together, that's sort of the sweet spot in where I think companies will find both the best opportunities and the least risk, and we as policymakers will find from the private sector the best contributions towards broader social goals like fighting climate change, like inequality, like some of the other things that we've been talking about. The only other point I'd make is that I think this particular panel is very interesting and right in the center of it, because people ask, what is ESG? What does that have to do with climate? ESG movement is happening in its way, on its own. Every company, no matter what space you're in, energy or not, are facing these issues. And the energy transition is happening on its own too. It doesn't have to be at a company level. If people at home are changing out for more climate-friendly solutions, whatever it might be. But where those two meet most directly is in the ESG issues in the energy space. And I'll just give the only example I'll cite to that is that when I was heading up for the state our work around decarbonizing the common retirement fund here in New York, which is the large pension fund. Let's just say that the company that was put on as the example as to why the fund should decarbonize was not an agricultural company. It was Exxon, right? Because the intersection of energy and ESG and these kind of issues is right at the heart of where all this is going to play. So I think this is very timely and obviously most profound for the companies and people playing in this particular space.
Excellent. Thank you, Adam. Sandy, could you talk with us a little bit about embedding sustainability in strategy at AEP? It's not just, I've heard that now there are executive VPs being appointed that in the realm of both strategy and sustainability. Before there were directors or VPs of sustainability, but I think companies are really trying to integrate the notion of sustainability in all three areas into corporate strategy. Can you give us a little perspective on that, please?
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay. Sorry, I was trying to make sure I wasn't the echo and muted myself. Sorry about that. So I think that Adam and Jackie really hit the nail on the head. There's a lot that goes into this, and it takes a lot of time to embed it within an organization. Even just learning the language and understanding how it relates. I love, Jackie, when you talk about governance from a stakeholder engagement perspective, because that is something that we've embraced for more than a decade at AEP, and how important it is to get those perspectives. You don't know what you don't know. And it is an information, it's an input to your decision making. And I can tell you, I love when I hear our executives at AEP talking about the just transition. And now we're talking about environmental justice, and we're taking a look at, our outreach practices for when we're citing infrastructure, whatever that is. And so, it's a process of constant education, bringing emerging issues to the table. And I love that, our executives have really embraced it at AEP, and now we're kind of pushing that through our strategy, but also through our employee and our workforce, and getting people to understand those connections. And that, we say we're going to transition to a clean energy future. Well, what does that really mean? When I think about the coal fleet that AEP owns and the coal units that we're retiring, what's happening to the people and to the communities, the people who work at the plants and the communities and the local and regional economies. And to your point, Jackie, we've got to think about those things, but then where are we putting those transmission lines, those solar panels, those wind farms? We've got to think about that as well. And it's really interesting. I mean, these issues have been around for decades, but the fact that they're front and center now as we're thinking about that clean energy transition it's exciting. It's daunting, but it's really exciting because it really gets to the people aspect of what we're talking about and what we're doing. So it's a journey, right? I mean, embedding it in our strategy, we have those conversations. I'm at the board level. Talking about ESG and sustainability and climate and just transition and all of those things. And you know what? 3 years ago, we weren't having those conversations to that depth. We were having them, but not at that level, and not at the deep level that we're having them now, as real considerations for how we move forward. So it's really an interesting time.
Jackie or Adam, do you want to add anything to Sandy's comments?
I would just, if I could, think when thinking about how companies might incorporate these considerations, I think, the one thought that comes to mind, we talked before a little bit about risks and opportunities. And I think it's important, and this is consistent with your experience, is that they are not separate. They're both sides of the same equation. That is to say, if you are a company looking to cite renewables, for example, you know, that you're going to have to deal with regulations and you have to deal with approval boards and whatever, and your ESG reputation, your ESG practices, your consistency of the values the company integrates to the local environment, with the state government, the local government, the, you know, federal policy, is going to play a role not just in your own ESG reporting and work in your company, but also, frankly, in how likely your project is to be chosen or to be cited or to get, you know, and to get approved. And so I think when companies think about integrating it, especially when it comes to the energy transition and the just transition aspects of it, as well as the, you know, climate aspects of it, it seems to me that the integration's really got to be part of this, into the strategy tightly like that, because they're going to feed each other in both positive and negative directions as this goes on.
Hey, thank you, Adam. Jackie, did you want to speak to that before we went to the next question?
I mean, well, sure. I guess it's very briefly just to affirm, so to not to be redundant, but yeah, for everything that we do, like, we recognize that we have to shift away from fossil fuel-based energy production because of its myriad harms. And as Martin Luther King says, all progress is precarious, and the solution to one problem can bring other problems without that level of intention that we need. And so we have a community we're working with now where that community is sandwiched between two efforts to develop solar farms. And they're concerned about the fact that they're not actually getting energy from either of those solar farms, and B, that all the trucks that are going to be coming through to do the installation and the work and so forth, that they're really not gaining directly from the farms, and they're potentially kind of suffering from a new low-bay air pollution that's going to be impacting. So as much as this is a necessary transition away from fossil fuel-based energy production, we want to make sure that the direction we move in, that we do it intentionally, and that we do it in a way that also moves us in the right direction without kind of unintended and collateral harms. So, thank you.
That's a good opening for my next question, which actually was going to be for you, Jackie. Environmental justice, what needs to happen? I'm sure there's a platform or a set of principles, no doubt, with your organization. Can you give us a sense of, you know, what in your mind, what are the top 3 to 4 things that need to happen to get from here to there?
Yeah, thank you. So first off, when we talk about principles, some of the key principles we think of in terms of process are the HAMES, principles of democratic organizing, which include letting people speak for themselves, includes bottom-up organizing. And so with those principles, the notion is that, as we talked about before, that the stakeholders, the frontline communities, need to be in the driver's seat in terms of what's happening. And so it really starts and ends there in terms of kind of what needs to happen. And really what falls from there will be that the way that those communities govern and make decisions are towards making sure that what we do is anchored in environmental preservation and conservation, so it doesn't harm the environment and the communities in the environment. That as we, in so doing, we think about economic justice and how we ensure that, whether it's job creation, business opportunities, and so forth, that the communities that have been traditionally marginalized and kept away from economic opportunities, that those economic opportunities are held by those communities first and foremost. And then we think about that critical to that, again, with frontline community leadership, we would see that we're also thinking a lot of the social and making sure we mitigate against social harms, but then we also elevate the social advantages and benefits, because as we know, the very definition of environmental justice is not just about the disproportionate negative impact, but it's the unequal distribution of burdens and benefits. So we really think very intentionally about lifting up other benefits as well. But all of that, again, starts and ends with frontline community leadership and engagement in the process. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Adam, can you speak a bit to the standardization of ESG metrics? Is it a benefit, a bureaucratic hassle? What's helpful? What's not helpful?
Well, this is a great question. I mean, this is to me, you know, I remember when I first started legging into this space, I want to say 5-6 years ago, you know, there was the alphabet soup of SASB and GRI and CDP and all this stuff. And you heard folks who are just starting to think about how to make these disclosures. Can't we just get one standard? Can't we just get one standard? I don't want to fill out this form and that form and this form and that form and all this and have different metrics. And the promise was that in 5 years we'd see convergence. Well, we're here 6-7 years later and we don't yet have convergence. And I think there's two things going on there. Well, first off, I would say it is critical, I think, Maribel, to the point to have some set of standardization, and because I think if you're going to change behavior, if you're going to reward behavior, if you're going to acknowledge ESG progress, right, you have to be able to think about apples to apples, whether you're an investor thinking about it from risks and opportunities, whether you're a consumer thinking about it from you know, voting with your feet or your dollars, or you're an employee, or you're a frontline community, Jackie, to your point about thinking about who to, I mean, all these things have to at some level have some ability for analysis. I think a standardization around this is critical, but I would add one wrinkle to it, and it's one that when I was director of state policy, I proposed, and we didn't quite get there, but I still have dreams that it might come to pass, and that is this. I think that one of the reasons we've gotten a little bit stuck, and it's not this, that has nothing to do with the terrific efforts by groups like the ones I mentioned before to bring around some standardization, is because I think at some level we're solving the wrong problem. And my own view here is this: disclosure regimes and rating regimes and all that has traditionally spoken to the investor, or put the investor in the middle of the view as to what matters to investors is what should be standardized or disclosed and whatnot. And that's great, but that's great if you're thinking only through the lens of what matters to investors. And here, when we talk about ESG, when we talk about just transition, we talk about climate policy, when we talk about inequality, these are social questions, these are societal questions, where the overlap between what's material to society and material to investor may not be 100%. So I've always thought that the way to get around this standardization issue was to sort of move it away a little bit from the what's material to investors dynamic, and more from a perspective of here's what, you know, matters, you know, to consumers, to employees, to others, and just things, pretty standard things we can talk about. What's your emission profile look like? What's your pay equity look like? What's your diversity look like in your company? And if you start thinking about that as a disclosure to an audience that's broader than just investors, my own view is that's going to be a lot more helpful as we go here. But it's a critical question, needs to be answered for all the reasons we've talked about. I apologize for going on a little bit there, but this is one of my favorite topics because it's one that I've done a lot of work in. I think it's going to be absolutely essential to driving the next chapter in this whole process.
Great, thank you. Sandy, can you speak to that as well?
Oh, absolutely. That's one of my favorite issues too, because I'm in the trenches doing it every day, along with many companies I'm sure who are on this webinar. The problem is that there's not one size fits all, right? So what's relevant and material to stakeholders, and I'll call them stakeholders because I think you're right, Adam, it's too narrow when it just focuses on investors. So what you have to think about is what's material to your stakeholders. And it's not going to be the same from sector to sector or even company to company, right? And that's the challenge. And so therefore you have this proliferation of ESG surveys and ratings and rankings. And then the other wrinkle in all of that is that they are beginning to realize the social aspect is missing, and they're beginning to add those pieces to it. And then the other piece of that too is that this is all voluntary. So companies, there's no mandate for companies to do this kind of disclosure. And that's another challenge too. So when companies are disclosing at different rates, different metrics, and all of this is being used to determine your access and cost to capital. It's being it's an input to whether you can insure your assets, whether you are able to, what your credit ratings are, and it's also, to your point, people vote. Whether it's an investor or a consumer, they're voting with their money, whether to support you or go somewhere else. And all of that is an input to those decisions that are being made. So it's a very complicated landscape right now. I'm not sure that we'll get to a standard, it would be nice. We know that the SEC is looking into this now, but we're already feeling the influence of what's happening in Europe with the EU directive and the sustainable finance disclosure regulation that just took effect in the EU. So it's a really complicated, messy process. It's necessary, but it is frustrating from a company perspective to have so many different aspects and so many surveys coming at you, and everyone is important, right?
So I know, for example, EEI has developed ESG Disclosure Template, and they've done it at least 2 times. And I looked at the template a little bit. I would imagine they're also going through the process of adjusting it to consider more social factors. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, we're actually on our 4th year of reporting that. That is, for those who are not aware of that, EEI members got together about 5 years ago and met with a group of investors. But we also brought in third-party organizations like MSCI and Sustainalytics and CDP, and even Ceres and a couple of other NGOs, and asked the question, what is decision useful data that you need? And let's do that as a sector. And so that's what we do. It's an ESG reporting template. There's a qualitative and a quantitative. And you're right, it evolves every year because the issues are changing all the time, and we want it to be relevant. So that is definitely, it's the only sector that's doing that. And I know that there are some investors who have shopped that around to other sectors. That one is specific to investors. There's also one on EEI that is specific to customers. And you were part of that effort, Maribel, with the WRI, in developing another template that meets the needs of our customers, because they're very different. We're scope 2 emissions in their supply chain. So we're trying to meet the needs of our different stakeholders, and everybody has a different need. And that's, there lies the challenge in getting some standardization, because it's not just one size fits all for us. Our stakeholders also need different things.
Thank you, Sandy. Now, the next question is, I'd like to begin with Jackie, but I'm sure you'll all have something to say on this. What is the role of government, of federal and state governments on these issues, if any?
Yeah, thank you. I think one role is, even going back to the prior question, I think that there is, as much as there would need to be some level of customization across companies and so forth, there is a baseline and minimum set of standards that we can establish across the E, the S, and the G, and also that one role would be to ensure that it's not a company coming up with the criteria, but that it's done in concert with the stakeholders who are impacted around the ESG. And so we need to be thinking about what a government role would be in helping to establish, monitor, and as needed to enforce. Another quote from Martin Luther King is that laws cannot create heart; they can only constrain the heartless. And so we know that there's kind of a lot of variation across, and we need to make sure that we do have some measures in place so that these actions and policies that are critical to life for some people are that there is some measure of actual regulation and mandatory adherence. And so let's kind of start briefly on that.
You know, we've been agreeing so much on everything. I'm wondering, do we have any dissenting views on this issue, just to liven things up a little bit?
I'll let Sandy go first. Not perhaps a dissenting view, but perhaps a different frame. But Sandy, I don't know if you want to jump in there before I throw my.
Well, I do. Yeah, I mean, I do think that government has a role to play. You know, you can't have the fox in the hen house, so to speak. You know, you've got to have some bumper pads around and some guardrails to help you and to provide some guidance. And we're seeing it show up not just at the federal level. We're seeing it from coming out of FERC and obviously with the Biden climate plan. But we're also hearing a lot about it in our states. And it's not just showing up on infrastructure siting issues. It's showing up on franchise agreements and indigenous land, you know, people and all of the things that we had never really, you know, encountered before, perhaps. But it's coming up and it's really changing the conversation inside the companies. You know, I get together with my peers every other month to have a conversation just on these issues. Because we want to learn from each other and who's got best practice and maybe who's got policies, who's got frameworks, how are you doing this? Because I don't know that any one of us has the best answer, but we're learning from people like Jackie and Adam, you know, what we must take into account as we go forward. And that's really important. It gets back to having voices heard.
Yeah, so I would just add on this. I mean, there's of course a role for government here in the classic carrot and stick sense, and you know, as someone who was involved in both sides of it as a regulator and also as trying to promote the climate agenda here in New York. I mean, certainly there's a lot to be done there, but just to take the spirit of your question, Maribel, up and maybe offer a slightly different perspective here, I think it may help in thinking about this question. Take a step back and ask, why is this ESG movement happening at all? Like, why are we here? And the reason I'll submit is that for a very long time, the way the private sector, corporate America, whatever you want to say, was going about its business with let's call it a shareholder primacy as opposed to a stakeholder model, has led some people to think that either one of two things are true: either that is producing or has produced negative externalities, climate pollution, inequalities, or was not an optimized model for producing the most good, positive externalities. And so if you think about it from the perspective of a little bit from let's call it a more social policy perspective, you see a lot of roles for government here in thinking about, I mean, the B Corp, we haven't talked about benefit corps and B Corps today. There's a whole movement about having thinking differently about how corporations should behave and how they should be structured and governed. There's impact investing. There's all sorts of aspects off of this that I think reflect the view that, and I think government can play a very constructive role here in widening the lens as to what we think about when we think about a corporation and its role in society. As I like to say, I used to teach a course on this, you know, it was not, when Moses came down the mountain from his chat with God, it was not like the Delaware general business laws were on the tablets, right? Because corporations are something we invented as a society to help promote economic growth, which is great, but it also can be adjusted over time as movements come up. So I would argue for a role of, whether it's government or policy more broadly, in expanding that playing field and thinking more broadly about how to integrate the corporate sector into these social issues. And I think that's what's underlying the ESG move anyway. So I would think that role is where we should be focusing as well.
Well said. I think this is the moment that we should probably move to opening the floor to the other questioners who've sent in questions. I'm just going to hold out there that we haven't yet talked about partnerships around ESG and maybe some outside the box partnerships that one wouldn't usually think of with people that might otherwise be your competitors or you're on the other side of the table. And hopefully we'll get to weave that into the Q&A period. So at this moment, I think I'd like to turn to Kevin Marin and ask him to start offering us questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the discussion so far. Thank you. We do have several questions lined up. A quick reminder to our audience that you can still submit questions and we'll work in as many as we have time for. First question here from Yulia Gagorgu. Who are the corporate leaders in sustainability in the US, and what is the standard for having ambitious action on ESG? Is a 100% net zero emissions goal a starting point or the height of action?
Wow, that's a great question. There are many leaders in ESG and sustainability in the U.S. And companies are leaders not in everything, but in some things, right? You can't be good at everything. So when I think about some of the leaders in just across the board, cross sector, I think about Intel. I love some of the social programs, especially around women and girls that they've done globally. They've done a lot of work around water stewardship. So that I think is one of a really great company and one of the leaders. Within our sector, I think there are many companies who are doing some really great things. PG&E in California has had an environmental justice manager program policies in place for more than a decade. They're leading the pack and helping the rest of us learn, what works, what doesn't, and the kinds of things that we need. From an ESG perspective, what is the, is it net zero? Is it 100% net zero? I think today net zero is your ticket to the game. I don't think anything short of that is acceptable anymore. And I say that as a result of conversations with investors and customers and lots of other different stakeholders. That's a basic expectation today of ESG performance. And I think it's really important because, your reputation and your brand are also impacted by your ESG profile. And if you have, a lousy profile, well, who's going to follow you? Who's going to buy your product? Whatever. And it also, like I said earlier, impacts your cost of doing business. So it's really, really important for companies to manage it. And that means, pay attention to who's reporting on you, what they're reporting on you, make sure they've got the accurate data, form those partnerships and relationships with those third-party organizations, understand their methodologies, and then communicate it. You've got to communicate it. You were talking about, Adam, I think you were really talking about was corporate purpose, right? So it's not just about the investors anymore. It's about, you see a lot of companies taking stands on social issues. I think that's going to continue. And the expectation is that you will, as a company, but that's also risky business.
Yep.
It's just trying to find that right balance, I think. Not an easy thing to do, but there are leaders doing some phenomenal things across all sectors.
Yeah. I would just add a comment. I don't know, Jack, if you want to jump in, but look, I think you're right that net zero is sort of table stakes on the climate side of this, but I think there is some risk in thinking about ESG leadership along the lines of such almost arbitrary or objective measures, right? For two reasons. One is it depends on what sector you're in, who you are, what your operations are, what you're doing, how you're efforting, all the trajectory of that. But more importantly, and we haven't maybe touched on this, E, S, and G don't always swim in the same direction. I mean, you could see decisions where companies are faced with questions around, well, we could cut emissions from our operations, but it would mean laying off a workforce or things where there's tension around some of these issues. And so I think I'm not necessarily arguing one or the other way should be, prevail, but when one thinks about an ESG performance, I think to your point, Sandy, it needs to be holistic, it needs to be directional, it needs to be strategic, and it needs to be, and this brings us back to the question of standardization. This doesn't lend itself to easy kind of click on off. But to your point, those are great companies. I mean, the one you always hear is Unilever, right? Because of Paul Pullman and his sort of and whatnot. There's others, but I think anyone who's doing a really good job is doing it from that perspective and not necessarily from a check the box, we hit this metric perspective.
I agree with that.
Great.
I might,
Oh, you're gonna ask another question?
I might add to that there are inevitably, and I'm glad, Adam, you brought this up. This kind of endeavor is never conflict free, and there are often trade-offs and competing interests. But the question is, how does one approach that work of competing interests, and how you bring people to the table to really face that both as an organization and your stakeholder communities, and to the best. Ultimately, decisions have to be made, but the best companies I find really know how to socialize the conflict, not just within their boardroom and their management, but within their stakeholder communities. And then, even though nobody's going to end up getting everything they want, but there's a much more positive outcome and positive energy about whichever decision was made and whichever direction it needed to go into.
Well, thank you very much for those answers. We do want to move on to the next question if we can. And speaking of standardization, I want to address one question from Jennifer Michael. ESG is not new. Increasing investor societal attention to it is, as is a growing expectation of greater transparency in ESG reporting. How is the energy industry responding to this?
So this is Sandy, and I'll take that. I think that the energy industry is on the leading edge of that, honestly. And I think the EEI ESG template is the report that we put out collectively as an industry, as an example of that. Energy touches our lives every single day. Everything we do, energy is tied to that in some way. And so we recognize the impact that has. And, I think to the trade-offs that we were just talking about, and, how are you going to make that transition and not have negative impacts or disproportionate impacts on people or communities or economies. And so that's one of the things that we worry about too, when we're thinking about ESG from an industry perspective, as well as from our company perspective. So, when we close coal plants, there's, the average coal plant generates about $160 million a year in direct, indirect, and induced impact, right? So that's the economic impact. There's for every job at one of our plants, another 2.3 jobs are created in the economy. So we can't just lock the doors and walk away. I think being a leader in this is really, dealing with the hard stuff, and how do you help employees and communities and economies make that transition and diversify. So we bring our, and it's not about writing a check, it's about helping to build capacity so that people and communities can be sustainable on their own in the future. And that's the hard work on the ground, right? And Stefan and Jackie, you can certainly, you're doing some of that hard work as well. But I think that's really how you lead. It's not just completing the surveys and getting good scores. It's the work that you're doing on the ground that really matters.
Thank you for that. I think that does tie in nicely to our next question here, which is from Anita Parlow, as well as we've had a few others on this concept regarding the scope of ESG metrics. So we're curious for the panelists' thoughts for how do you expand upon the questions? Are there areas not currently captured by ESG metrics that should be considered in the future, or is there a need to expand these beyond where they currently are?
Start, Adam?
Well, I don't know. I'm smiling because it goes to the question we were just talking about a little bit, right? Which is what are we solving for with ESG, and is ESG these sort of tools you're talking about good tools to help solve that, to provide that solution? And I wonder, maybe Jackie to you, but as we're seeing increasingly a focus on the kind of issues you work on, as I say, I came to ESG somewhat awkwardly from the G side. I'm an environment, climate person in my core, and as this concept is evolving to take on more scope and get deeper into social issues that are coming more to the fore every day, whether it's the pandemic or racial justice or criminal, all the things that we're sort of seeing around incorporated. I think the ESG space is currently flexible enough to expand to do that, but that also might be one of the reasons we're not seeing the standardization and the cost that we talked about earlier, because there isn't standardization, because it's a morphing kind of moving concept. So I wonder about the interplay between those two, especially as the concepts shift. My own view is that we might want to not try to do everything with one club. That is to say, maybe have some set of standards where things that we know we can measure now around, say, emissions or around whatever, and then continue to evolve on these other issues as they get more integrated. But I don't know if others have thoughts. It just sort of goes to the question about what we're trying to solve for
here. Yeah, I would definitely, and kind of maybe even going back to several questions ago and combining them all, but that this whole issue of so just taking the one metric, for example, of net zero emissions, that if we have net zero emissions, then the challenge is in the word net, and what might be happening on the S side in terms of, and so there's so many, so one thing that we need to be thinking about is there a hierarchy among these, or is there kind of the ways that they intersect? Are there guardrails around the ways that dealing with one without dealing with the other is going to have these unintended consequences, but impactful consequences that might cancel out what has been done in one. And so we really need to be super deliberative about the consequences of any action that we're taking. And I think that the ESG needs to be a lot more. There needs to be that intersectional lens, and there needs to be metrics that are also intersectional. It can't be, just like a list, like separate lists and columns, that they need to be very integrated. Just is another concrete example around that is just taking the example even around coal, that yes, in terms of job creation and folks who have the jobs, you could say that that's something on the S side, and of course then the impacts on the environment side, and then the ones that come back and bite those same people on the S side because of fossil fuel-based energy production. And then actually even impacting governance. So because when you're making those huge amounts of profits, you're using those profits to push back against clean energy, clean air rules, and then using them to pay into groups like ALEC that pushed on school privatization, prison privatization, water privatization, and voter suppression, then we really see a pretty complicated cycle of interconnections that have to be dismantled and delinked and dealt with.
I would just add to that data alone is not sufficient. You've got to provide context around, what it is that you're reporting, and companies really need to own it. When we're talking about metrics, we could talk about metrics and which are the right ones until you're blue in the face, right? But you can't just throw data out there. My philosophy has always been show me, don't just tell me. I can tell you we're doing it and give you the number and say, look, we spent, $1 million over here, but what was the impact of that, right? What was the outcome? And I think that's very important in providing context around it, so you understand it a little bit better, and then you can start to see the connections too. When you start building the story and putting that context around it, you can see where the gaps are too. And I think that's super important.
Thank you for that. We do want to I think we have time for one or two more questions here. Question from Mike Lubell. What is the general impact of ESG on corporate bottom lines? Assuming it is negative, and in the absence of governmental mandates, what are the most effective messaging companies employ to justify ESG expenditures to their shareholders?
Well, I don't know, Sandy, this is probably more for you than the others, but just to throw in there, I'm not sure I agree with the premise. That is to say, well, two things. I think a lot of companies have made the case, and the BRT made the case, and others, that incorporating ESG is itself material to the performance, overall broader performance of the company, both long term and in its consumer relationships, its employee relationships, its community relationships. So I think there is a very strong move out there with data to back it up that suggests that an increased focus on ESG is actually alpha creating for companies. But I would just throw in and turn over that that is also at the heart of what I suggested earlier, which is why I think thinking about ESG through the lens of whether or not it is good or bad for investors, or the bottom line is may not be the right or not the entire lens for policy solutions, because the problems we're addressing are social or societal, not necessarily within the company itself. So that's sort of plays into the conversation as before. But Sandy, how do you guys? Is it good for you guys?
It absolutely is, because think about it, okay? Financial performance is financial performance. ESG is your non-financial performance. And that is today as important as your financial performance. And those things are intertwined, right? You can't have one without the other. So, it definitely has been raised to that level. Your point about the BRT, the Business Roundtable, the corporate purpose focus, that's absolutely right. I mean, when you look at your non-financial performance, I look at the questions I get from investors. They're asking us about culture. They're asking us about the diversity of our workforce, not just the board, but they want to know the workforce as well. They're asking us about, how are you preparing your workforce for the future? They're asking us things that are not financial in nature, that you wouldn't report to the SEC, for example. But those things are completely intertwined. And so, again, I think it's, I don't see how you separate those things. I think they're just, we look at it as one and the same. And now we're beginning to leverage that. So we just signed a $5 billion credit revolver and about a couple of weeks ago, and it is tied to ESG metrics. It's tied to our transition and renewable growth, but it's also tied to our safety performance for our employees. So, it's beginning to show up where, if we perform well, we pay less, in terms of interest on that, or if we don't perform, we pay more. And that's risky, but it also drives performance. So it's putting your money where your mouth is on some of these really, really important issues.
Great. So I think we have time for just one last question here. Question is from John Perkins. If an energy company engages with fossil fuel production and use, how does it accommodate its ESG policy with the call by well-known economists that the fossil fuel industry must end? We can expand that to how does interacting with what are considered to be less clean industries impact ESG metrics?
Fossil fuel is definitely still very much a part of our energy picture today. Making that transition is something that is a conscious decision that's being made, and it's not being made necessarily by the energy companies themselves. I think our customers are driving that. I see that for AEP. Our customers want 100% clean energy to power their businesses. And if we're not in that business, then we're not going to survive. So I don't think it's the energy companies per se that are driving that. It's really coming from what stakeholders and who are customers, investors, who are NGOs, who are communities, that's what they want. And we're just helping to make that transition and going in that direction. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think you'll see some fossils, particularly natural gas, as a bridge until we get other technologies and other resources where it needs to be, because who wants to be the one with no electricity for 6 hours a day, right? I mean, that's the reality if we don't have, reliable sources of energy. So it's not easy for sure. It's not popular in not everybody embraces that, but it's not the energy companies or the energy sector, I don't think, that is really driving it. It's coming from our customers and other stakeholders who that's what they want.
No, I would agree with that. I'd only add to it that I think the scope of the transition and the work we're taking, everybody should be a part of it. So I don't think anybody should be. I mean, if anyone's willing to come along with it, you certainly should be welcome to the party. Let's go.
Now, I hate to jump in here because this has been a fascinating conversation. This is such a clearly important area and such a moving picture that I think we at OEP are going to have to do additional forums and discussions on the topic. I may impose on some of you to rejoin us because you have shed such light on this for our audience, and I really appreciate it. Thanks to Sandy, to Jackie, and to Adam, and certainly to Maribel for moderating in such a great way this conversation. I also want to thank our audience for taking the time to join us today. Hope everyone has stayed safe and healthy. I want to encourage you to dig deeper into this issue by using our program, the Our Energy Library, on the OEP website, where there are many materials on this and, of course, all energy-related topics. And finally, I want to thank our co-host Broadscale and all of our partners for supporting our program. To all of you, have a great rest of the week. And once again, to our panelists and moderator, thank you for the time and for a fascinating discussion on such an important topic. Have a great day and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you,
Thanks,
Sandy.
everybody.
Adam.